Today's episode is brought to you by Patreon. If you're interested in supporting the show, go to patreon.com/JoshuaRevelis and become a $2 backer today and get early access to the new episodes. I'll be leaving a link down in the description to the page, but for now, on to today's episode. You're listening to the Augmented Experience podcast. My name is Joshua Revelis. I'm a student, musician, and a gamer at heart. Join me as I sit down with fellow enthusiasts to talk about what's going on in the technology, business, and gaming world. I hope you guys enjoy. Alright, everybody, welcome back to the show. My name is Joshua Revelis. I'm your host as usual. And to be honest with you guys, the day I'm recording this episode, I did not have the best of mornings. I kind of got really sick. My stomach started hurting, and I have no idea what realistically caused it, and it caused me to not go to cow class, but that's all right. We didn't really do much there, but anyways, that's aside from my personal things going on. So today's episode is kind of going to be interesting because it is related to console gaming, which I know a vast majority of people enjoy. Like, obviously, I personally have multiple consoles. I have my Xbox, I have my Switch, and then obviously I have my PC for gaming as well. So I can understand where we're going with this conversation, especially because we're going to talk about the PS5 leaks and the rumored Xbox Scarlett, which its code name, they're calling it the Scarlett, so we're just going to refer to it as a Scarlett, because that's the code name and we don't officially have what it could be called realistically. So we're going to talk about the recent PS5 leaks. We're going to talk about the Xbox leaks. After we're done talking about those leaks, we're going to go into detail about why they're important, and mainly I want to share my thoughts about it, and then we'll go into like a little subsection with that. So I want us to talk about the recent leaks because these are very important, because a lot of people have been talking about these leaks recently. And I'm going to be going through two different sources. The first one is going to be from, if I'm correct, Scylla Cornera. If I'm probably butchering that. And then the other one is going to be from Comic Book WWG. So these two provided inside information because it is interesting, because the leaks for the PlayStation 5 didn't actually come from just some random person on the internet. It actually came from one of the lead people in Sony, essentially, Mark Cerny. And if you don't know who Mark Cerny is basically Sony Interactive Entertainment's lead architect, is what he is. And he recently did an interview with Wired, essentially, an interview to share his very first details on the company's next generation console that is yet to be revealed. So let's talk about some of the key points in this interview, because it is interesting. And I mainly want to start with what Cerny said, this little quote that he said that the Wired is quoting from what Cerny said in the interview. The key question is whether the consoles adds another layer to the sorts of experiences you already have access to, or if it allows for the fundamental changes in what a game can be. According to Cerny, the next generation console, quotation marks, will not be released in 2019. However, a number of studios have been working with it, and Sony recently accelerated its deployment of dev kits in order to provide game creators with time to adjust its capabilities. So, essentially that's, I'd say, a little bit of an abstract, but obviously we're going to go into more details about it and break it down a little bit further. But overall, this provides the idea that yes, the PlayStation 5 is already in developers' hands. They're already testing it, because that's a normal thing that happens in the industry, is people test out the hardware before we even get to see it, because they're obviously running the prototypes to see how games can handle with it and how to adapt games with it. So, but I want us to think about this quote that Cerny really said at the beginning, which is the first thing they quoted, which is questioning, how are you going to innovate, or how are you going to add another layer to the experience that is already there? And I think it's interesting, especially when we look at the current generation we have now, which is the PlayStation 4 Pro and obviously the Xbox One X. Obviously, yes, they're there is no debate. Yes, the X is the more powerful console. It is far more powerful than the Pro by a good margin. However, due to Microsoft not having as many first-party games to utilize that hardware, yes, it is harder to sell the console. Realistically, let's be real. Obviously, the Pro is cheaper than it by a little bit, and the Pro has more games available. The only problem is when it comes to the big games that are available to both platforms, yes, the Xbox will run them far better. Let's be real. Like Red Dead Redemption 2 actually runs 4K 60 on the Xbox One X with no issue, while the PlayStation 4 can barely even do 30. So you get the point. But let's continue. Continuing on with what was talked about in the Siliconera interview, they talk about that Sony's next console will have an AMD-based chip based on the third generation of AMD's Ryzen line with 8 cores of the company's new 7nm Zen 2 microarchitecture. So essentially, if we want to sum that up, because I know a lot of you are not going to know what that means, essentially, we're getting rid of the old crappy Jaguar CPUs that were inside of the old consoles. Blessed, because those things were garbage, and realistically, yes, they bottlenecked the consoles hard. Like, it was really bad on how those Jaguar CPUs essentially bottlenecked the consoles. And it's interesting that they're going that route with AMD. Obviously, yes, I do agree that it is interesting that they're going with AMD. I think, in terms of competing with Intel, then I think it was a really good choice to go with AMD, especially because AMD as a whole is more known for multitasking, and obviously for console, I feel like that's more reliable in that sense, because you're not streaming heavily and you don't need the raw power of the Intels, because obviously the AMD cores can outperform the Intel ones in some situations. Being realistic, depending on which one it is, like if we're talking about a Threadripper 2, which I'm going to be honest, that's never going to be in a console, then yeah, the Threadripper 2 easily outnumber, like, I can't even begin to describe, like, I know this is a thing, but I can't begin to describe how much the Threadripper 2 outperforms the Intel cores by a large margin. Like, it's ridiculous. But going back to the point, so we got AMD based architecture essentially, and it's Zen 2. So second generation, 7nm, great, 8 cores, lovely. That works perfectly well for these things. Obviously, when it comes to the GPUs, we're not going to get your traditional graphics cards inside of them, clearly, because that's going to raise the price by a large margin, so they have to make a custom one. So as for the GPU, it is a custom variant of Radeon's Navi family. It'll support ray tracing. That's one thing we'll talk about. A technique that models the travel of light to simulate complex interactions in 3D environments. Essentially, ray tracing is a new feature that's becoming popular in the NVIDIA line of graphics cards. Obviously, yes. Like, Radeon is also adding them as well based on, like I said, the Navi family. And so it is an interesting feature, especially because we're getting that on consoles so soon, which is interesting because not that many PCs have it. But the fact that AMD, is now starting to implement that in their cards, and at the same time, NVIDIA is starting to implement them to more of their cards. Obviously not the 10 series, let's be honest, they won't do it. It is interesting, in my opinion. So let's continue. I want to skip over this where it talks over the immediate effects and things like that, because that's not necessarily important, but I think realistically it's not the premise, especially when the whole premise of the article is focused more on backwards compatibility, ray tracing, and the possibility of having an SSD inside of these things. Obviously, the spec jump is huge because it's well needed, to be honest. They needed to get rid of the old cores and everything like that, but let's continue. So another big point that they talk about as well is the next generation of PlayStation VR. So in the article, when asked whether there will be a next generation PlayStation VR to go along with the PS5, Sony says VR is very important to the company, and the current PlayStation VR headset is compatible with the new console, but didn't share more on that. However, with the new CPU and GPU's ability to deliver unprecedented visual and audio, I don't know why they did that, audio effects in a game, it doesn't rule out the possibility of an upgraded version in the future. So obviously VR is starting to become a big thing. It is starting to pick up steam. The only problem is, as mentioned before, it's a wonky market, especially because not that many people really want to buy it. So I think making it available to the console market is a good idea, especially because Nintendo is starting to implement Labo kits that are essentially VR headsets. So it is interesting because a lot of these companies are going in that direction. Obviously, Microsoft is more focused on cloud gaming and rather than VR, but that I know that's not ruling it out of the possibility. Obviously, Sony has the VR, and it's actually pretty good, pretty successful. It has some games on there. It doesn't have a ton, but you get the point. So I want to, and then here it talks about the thing relating to the hard drive and SSD, and seeing this is where it catches my eye a little bit, because the fact that they want to go with an SSD is huge, especially because obviously if anybody that owns an SSD or a hard drive, you know that a hard drive is not going to read and write things as fast as an SSD. An SSD is meant for moving information far quicker than a hard drive. The only difference is, main differences is clearly a hard drive has mechanical parts inside and a SSD doesn't. The SSD is just able to go, and you have a less likely chance of breaking it. Obviously, yes, it's far more expensive for more storage. So the more storage you get, the more expensive it gets. But I digress. So going into it, what Cerny finds more interesting is the hard drive, what he considers the key to the next generation, quotation marks, do demonstrate the decreased loading time of Sony's next generation console. Cerny compared the loading time of the 2018 PS4 title Spider-Man running on the PS4 Pro, which took about 15 seconds for Spidey to fast travel. When doing the same thing on the next gen dev kit, an early low speed version, so this isn't a fully clocked version connected to a different TV, it only took 0.8 seconds. Cerny, in quotation marks, no matter how powered up you get as Spider-Man, you can never go any faster than this, because that's simply how fast we can get the data off the hard drive. During its demonstration, Cerny paused the action to prove that the surrounding environment remained crisp. While the demonstration was used with a 4K TV, the next-gen console will support 8K graphics. Sony wouldn't share details about the SSD, including its makers and whether it utilizes the new PCIe 4.0 standard, but Cerny says it has raw bandwidth higher than any SSD available for PCs. So obviously, this is going to be interesting because we don't know who's making this SSD, and that's pretty a high claim you're making, that it's going to run faster than any SSD on a PC. It's interesting because, PC SSDs are really great, and we always make the joke when playing Rainbow, when the game takes forever to load, why don't you have it on an SSD? But it's very important because an SSD is just overall better, especially when you're running tasks and you're running very graphic intensive things. You want it to feel as smooth and buttery and make the transition to load screens or even getting the game booted up. You want it to be quick and snappy and not take so long. Obviously, yes, I love a hard drive because hard drives are cheaper, and obviously, yes, not only are they cheaper, but you can get more storage for less than an SSD. But in terms of reliability, you have more reliability with an SSD. That's why I went with an SSD for recording the episodes of the show, because not only can it transfer the data much easier, and I don't have to worry about load times as much, but it's able to read and write it without that much issue. And at the same time, yes, 500 gigabytes, especially when you're working with megabyte files and even less, you get what I mean. It's not going to run out anytime soon, realistically. So that's mainly what I want to do, but I want to end this article with at least with what Cerny said and how he ended the interview. Cerny stated that the raw read speed is important, but so are the details of the I/O, input-output, mechanisms, and the software stack that we put on top of them. I got a PS4 Pro, and then I put in an SSD that costs as much as the PS4 Pro. It might be 1/3 faster. And that's essentially everything that was stated in the Silicon Era article that they wrote. Obviously, they got the inside scoop with what was going on with the interview with The Wired. And essentially, as looking over the comic book one, it is similar. The only difference is that they talk about what we can expect, when we should expect it. Obviously, 2020 is the rumor that it's going to get pushed back, and that there's a possibility that Horizon Zero Dawn 2 is in the works as well. But at the same time, it also gives you an idea of what the price might be. And its price, I think it's fair for what they're charging, but obviously you're pushing in that market. And obviously the rumor is that it may be 500. 500 clean is the rumor. Obviously, anybody that owns a PS4 Pro, no, or more specifically the PS4, because that's the main one we want to focus on, that it's going to be $100 more than the base PS4. Obviously, the Pro is, I think, it's like $450, somewhere in that range, if I'm correct. I haven't really remembered that much. So we're looking at a PS5, and we're looking at probably 500. Obviously, a lot of people are saying that it's still going to settle. It's still going to sell it at a. Sony's going to sell it at a loss. Essentially, is what we're looking at, by about $100. Because obviously, with what they're rumoring to put inside of this thing, especially when you include an SSD, you're definitely gonna. It's gonna. Essentially, this is what happened. It's the same thing that happened with the Xbox One X. It costs more to make the thing than it does than what they're selling it for, essentially. And it's interesting that Sony's going this route, especially because when we look at consoles that started at a $500 price range, realistically, they didn't sell well. If you remember the original PS3 launch, it didn't sell so well when the price was so high. And the same thing goes for the original Xbox One. That's the reason I didn't get it until like 2 years after it came out, because nobody wanted the Kinect. The Kinect was garbage. And I'd rather have the Xbox One, the base original Xbox One, for $350 than pay $500 for it. The Kinect was useless, essentially. And another thing that they're talking about is probably a more premium version of PlayStation Plus. And this article does become a little bit more wonky because they're essentially saying that it won't have an SSD and that it will have a hard drive instead. That it'll be 2 terabytes built in, and it supports up to 8K upscaling, compatible with the newly upgraded PlayStation VR. So obviously they're referring to much more, like, this is going more on speculation that yes, we will get a new VR headset, which I don't doubt. Obviously, it's not going to talk about the SSD because they feel like that's not that important. So I think that's kind of interesting. That's mainly what the other article does. But it's also interesting because comicbook.org, after they did this article, and this article came out on April 15th, they actually did an article 3 days later on April 18th saying that the next Xbox is reportedly more powerful than the PS5. So let's talk about this one real quick. So this week, Sony Interactive's official announced, I like how they say officially announced. There really wasn't a official announcement. But it talks about how backwards compatibility, load times over 19 times faster than the PS4. They start going on that, and then we go to Twitter, essentially is what they start. Journalist Ainsley Bowden, if I'm saying that right, quotes that she's citing multiple insiders, quotation marks, has said that the next-gen Xbox, codename Xbox Scarlett, will be, quotation marks, more advanced than the PS5. What this means exactly isn't clear, but it suggests that it will be more powerful and perhaps be more feature-loaded than what Sony has cooking up. Essentially, to me, this doesn't surprise me, especially given what we got with the One X. Obviously, Microsoft really hit a home run essentially with the X. Like, the X is an incredibly powerful console. For the price, yes, it is incredibly powerful. And I know I've gone into multiple debates with people about building a PC for $500 that can outperform the X. Realistically, and I still stand by this opinion, you cannot build a stable, reliable PC for $500 without compromising somewhere. You can't. Like, you can build it. Trust me. You can build a PC for $500 that's just as powerful as the X. The only problem is that it is very, very filled with compromises. If you look at a lot of builds, they are pretty filled with compromises. They rely heavily on a lot of used parts. Some might recommend even cheaping out on the thermals and everything, and that's really scary because you can't cheap out on thermals on a PC. You have to make sure that the PC is properly cooled and that it's able to handle all the power, essentially. So we already saw this with the X. The X was far more powerful than the Pro. But now they're saying that Microsoft is going to do it again, except it'll be a little bit more obvious this time, clearly, especially when we're going in the realm of 8K, which, to be honest, I don't see the point of doing 8K, but oh well. But what they're boasting essentially is that, in the article, it's unclear how the next Xbox could be more advanced than the PS5, which boasts 8K graphics, insanely fast load times, ray tracing, 3D audio, and basically everything you find in a high-end PC at the moment. In other words, if the next Xbox is indeed more advanced technically, then it will have to be quite a piece of hardware, essentially, which suggests a hefty price point, unless Microsoft is willing to eat some big losses up front, which I feel like that's what essentially Sony and Microsoft is going to end up doing if these consoles end up, realistically, if they sell them at a loss, because they'd rather have more people buy them, because even though, yes, they're not making their profit back, they're still getting them in the hands of consumers, and based on what we're hearing, yes, they will be comparable to high-end PCs, essentially. The only difference is they won't run Windows, clearly, and yeah, you're just going to run with the subscriptions and everything, and I think a lot of people will be fine with that. But obviously the whole premise is that these things probably won't come out till 2020 at least, 2021 at best. There's no way we're getting these things in 2019, unless if they throw a curveball, but we'll talk about that. So, now that we got these out of the way, essentially, I mainly want to discuss why they're important, because I feel like we need to address why these are important. Essentially, the reason I believe the next Xbox and PlayStation 5 are very important comes down to the principle of basically high-end gaming for less price, essentially. And I know what a lot of people say is that realistically it's cheaper to buy a PC. It's like, in the long run, and I do agree with it, it does make more sense to buy a PC for a large price up front than basically than just buying an Xbox or a PlayStation, because all you're paying for on your PC is your internet bill, and that's it. That's all you're paying, unless if you have, subscriptions or things like that on there. But on Xbox, obviously, yes, you have to take into account the price of the console is going to be far lower. It's going to be pretty powerful as well. But you also have to take into account you're paying for the subscription fees, and then you're paying for the other subscription. Like, it adds up essentially. And overall, in the long run, it makes it end up being more expensive, even though that the PC, you paid more up front, but in the long run, you paid less, essentially. And it's interesting, in my opinion, because the fact that the next Xbox and PlayStation will be incredibly powerful, essentially, because they are running a new core, which is the main thing they needed, and the possibility of SSDs is intriguing, in my opinion. I think that this is a step in the right direction for these companies, especially that a lot of people think that Microsoft should just give up on the Xbox and just stop selling it, essentially. But obviously, even though Microsoft basically Microsoft owns Windows, they make it, essentially, that, in my opinion, it's kind of funny when we look at it. Yeah, it's like Microsoft already has the premier software on a computer, essentially. Almost every computer runs Windows besides Macs, obviously. And in my opinion, it's interesting because the fact that Microsoft is taking the Xbox brand and they're going to make it all together. The problem is that Xbox is still very popular. Like, a lot of people still love the Xbox. Even though, yes, Microsoft wants to make it connect everywhere and they want to have this big connection between PCs, phones, and Xbox. Obviously, yes, this runs into an issue because, like I said, why would you pay for an Xbox when you can get everything else on your phone or your PC? And it makes it wonky, especially when it comes to exclusives. But Sony, obviously, they don't really have much. They don't own a PC market or anything. And, their consoles are still making very popular first-party games. Obviously, yes, in my opinion, when it comes to first-party games, I think Nintendo overall always takes the cake because, well, their games are just very intuitive. They have an entire library of party games. They have really good story games. Like, it's incredible. But I think we really need to consider this. It's interesting. The next Xbox and PlayStation play a key role in how the market is going to change eventually when it comes to PC gaming. I think this is where we begin to see a shift, essentially, is that the power of a PC is now going to be bestowed upon a console. Obviously, yes. Do I believe that the next Xbox and PlayStation will catch up to a high-end PC? Not necessarily. I don't think it will, especially because they are running custom graphics cards and they're not running a proper graphics card. Obviously, the CPU is a little bit more straightforward, I'd say, in that sense, because they are going to run new CPUs clearly. So I think that saves their butt. I think when they come out, they are not going to be equivalent to the high-end PCs of that year, especially because, being realistic, technology, especially when it comes to computer parts, advances pretty quickly. Like, we kind of move really fast and people like upgrading really quickly. So I don't think they're going to outpower or even perform equally with those things, but I think it is going to be interesting to watch them. But going into the next thing, what do I think about the leaks? I think the leaks are onto something. Obviously, the Sony one holds a little bit more credibility due to the fact that it was from Mark Cerny. The only difference is that Mark Cerny could just be saying things just to yank our chain and just lead us into another direction. Obviously, the specs we're not really that worried about it, to be honest, because we kind of had an idea that these were the specs, especially because previous leaks before. And it's interesting because it lines up with what we knew, obviously. Obviously, the Sony one seemed to be more beefed up than what we originally thought, but the Xbox one seemed to be falling in line. Now, as mentioned, I do not believe we will see these things in 2019. However, I think when we think about it, E3 is coming around the corner, and this is the point I wanted to talk about. I believe at E3, since even though Sony's not going to be there, Sony said that they won't be attending E3, and I don't know if they're holding their PlayStation experience this year either, or if they just canceled it. But I do believe Microsoft is going to show some teaser for the next Xbox at E3. Obviously, if we even want to bring in Nintendo has something up their sleeve. Obviously, the rumors of the Switch Mini and things like that, but that's a story for another time, essentially. But the Xbox specifically. Do I believe that Microsoft is ahead when it comes to the console? I believe they are farther ahead than Sony at this point, but I just don't see it coming out in 2019, guys, to be honest. I think 2020 at best. The PlayStation 5, based on what we're hearing, won't be ready till 2021 at least, or 2020 if they're well on track, essentially. But it is interesting. I think at E3, we should see something, at least the name reveal of the next Xbox. It's probably already assumed the next PlayStation will just be the PlayStation 5, but the Xbox, I want to see what the real name is, especially because the last Xbox was the Xbox One. So what are they going to call it? Like, are they just going to reboot it and say like Xbox 2, or like, what are they going to call this thing? We have no idea. So I would keep your eyes peeled for E3. If you're going to watch it or even go, like, I would probably stop by the Microsoft booth and see what's going to go on, because to be honest, I would not be surprised if Microsoft at least gave a name drop. At least. Not even show a picture of it, just name drop. Just say, hey, this is the official name of the next Xbox. And they talk about its capabilities. I wouldn't say they go into detail about specs, but at least talk about it and what it can do, I think. Overall, I think that's the best course of action, essentially. But I think overall, that's all I got for you guys regarding these leaks, because, like I said, these are leaks. Like, these aren't absolute guaranteed facts. Obviously, the Sony one holds a little bit more weight due to the fact that it is from Mark Cerny. But I think we should keep these things in the back of our mind, essentially, and maybe take them with a little bit of grain of salt, because obviously things can change. We know they have the dev kits, and the dev kits are subject to change. So all we can really do is just wait and see what happens, essentially. But I think E3 is the main place to keep your eyes open, especially because I feel like we will see something of the next Xbox there. Clearly, I think we will. So yeah, that's really all I got for you guys. I hope you guys enjoyed today's episode. I know I sound a little bit more dead inside because, like I said, I'm not feeling so good, but the show must go on. We have to do the episode. So I hope you guys enjoy. I thank you guys for listening to the show. I hope you guys have a wonderful week. Probably hope you have a better week than I am so far. But I love you guys to death. Thank you guys so much for listening to the show. It really means a lot to me. So until next time, guys, I'll see you guys next week. Bye, guys.